A day in the life of a medieval peasant. Imagine waking up tomorrow not to the sound of an alarm clock, but to the crow of a rooster. There's no electricity, no running hot water, no refrigerator, no grocery store around the corner, not even a clock. You have no idea what time it is, but you know one thing for certain. It's time to start working. That was how the day began for millions of people throughout the Middle Ages. Modern movies often portray this period in one of two extremes, either as a romantic world filled with knights, castles, and fairy tales, or as an age of endless mud, disease, and misery. The truth, however, is far more fascinating. Did medieval peasants really work every single day without a break? What did they eat before potatoes even existed in Europe? Why did they drink ale instead of water? What time did they go to bed without electricity? How many miles did they walk every day? And was life really as unbearable as we often imagine? In this video, we'll spend an entire day in the life of an ordinary medieval peasant, from the moment they wake up until they fall asleep after sunset. You'll discover what they ate, how hard they worked, why church bells controlled almost every aspect of daily life, and which popular myths about the Middle Ages simply aren't true.
So, leave the 21st century behind for a little while, and let's step into a world where survival was a daily challenge, and every new day began with the rising sun. What time did a medieval peasant wake up? Most medieval people didn't own clocks. Their daily schedule wasn't determined by numbers on a watch, but by the movement of the sun. During the summer, peasants usually woke up between 4 and 5 in the morning, just as dawn was breaking. In winter, they slept longer because sunrise came later and there was much less work to do in the fields. Instead of an alarm clock, they woke to natural sounds: the crowing of roosters, barking dogs, livestock stirring in the barn, or church bells ringing in nearby villages. But they didn't immediately rush into the fields. The first tasks of the day included lighting the fire, fetching water from a well or stream, feeding chickens, pigs, cows, or goats, and preparing a simple breakfast. Only after taking care of these essential chores would the family begin the day's main work. One fascinating fact surprises many historians. Medieval Europeans often practiced what is known as segmented sleep. They would fall asleep shortly after sunset, wake up naturally for an hour or two in the middle of the night to pray, talk, tend the fire, or finish small household tasks, and then go back to sleep until dawn. Life followed nature's rhythm. The sun, not a clock, dictated when people worked, rested, and slept.
What did a medieval peasant eat? If you imagine a medieval dinner filled with roasted meat, cheese, and fine wine, you're probably picturing nobles rather than ordinary peasants. The average peasant's diet was simple but practical. Bread formed the foundation of nearly every meal. However, it wasn't the soft white bread we know today. Most peasants ate dark bread made from rye, barley, or oats because wheat was expensive and generally reserved for wealthier people. Breakfast often consisted of bread, porridge made from oats or barley, cheese, and a mug of weak ale. This may sound strange today, but medieval ale contained very little alcohol and was often safer to drink than untreated water because the brewing process required boiling. Lunch usually included vegetable soup made from cabbage, onions, beans, peas, carrots, or turnips. Families that kept gardens relied heavily on whatever vegetables they could grow themselves. Meat was surprisingly rare. Pork, chicken, or beef were mostly reserved for religious festivals or after animals were slaughtered in late autumn. Eggs, cheese, dried fish, and legumes provided much of the protein in everyday meals. Perhaps the biggest surprise is what wasn't on the table. Medieval Europeans had never seen potatoes, tomatoes, corn, peppers, or chocolate. These foods only arrived after Columbus reached the Americas in the late 15th century. Food wasn't about pleasure, it was fuel for survival.
Where and how long did medieval peasants work? A peasant's working day depended almost entirely on the season. Spring and summer were incredibly demanding. During planting and harvest, people worked from sunrise until sunset. That doesn't mean they labored without stopping for 12 straight hours. They paused briefly to eat, pray, or rest, but the physical workload remained enormous. Most peasants farmed small plots of land that supported their own families. However, many were also required to work several days each week on land owned by their local lord. This labor obligation formed an important part of the medieval feudal system. Their tasks changed throughout the year. In spring, they plowed fields and planted crops. During summer, they weeded fields, cut hay, and cared for livestock. Autumn was harvest season, followed by storing grain and gathering firewood. Winter brought fewer farming tasks, but there was still plenty to do. Repairing tools, fixing houses, weaving baskets, spinning wool, making clothing, and preparing for the next growing season. Contrary to popular belief, medieval peasants didn't necessarily work harder than modern people every single day of the year. Their workload fluctuated dramatically depending on the agricultural calendar. Why was livestock so important? For a medieval family, animals weren't simply pets. They were the difference between survival and starvation. Every morning began with feeding the animals before any field work could start. Cows provided milk, which could be turned into butter and cheese. Chickens supplied eggs. Sheep produced wool for clothing. Pigs were the primary source of meat. Oxen pulled heavy plows through the fields. Losing even one cow could be financially devastating. Livestock also served as a family savings account. During difficult times, animals could be sold or traded for grain, tools, or other necessities. Before winter, many families slaughtered pigs because feeding them through the cold months required more food than most households could spare. The meat was salted, smoked, or dried to preserve it for months. Horses were faster than oxen, but much more expensive, making them a luxury that many peasants simply couldn't afford. Taking care of livestock wasn't optional. Whether it was raining, snowing, or freezing outside, the animals still needed food and water every single day. For medieval peasants, the barn was often just as important as the fields themselves. What did a medieval peasant eat for lunch? If you think of lunch as a hot meal enjoyed around a table, there wasn't usually enough time to return home in the middle of the day. Every hour counted, especially during planting and harvest. Instead, lunch was usually eaten in or near the fields. A typical meal might include a piece of dark rye bread, a slice of cheese, boiled eggs, onions, garlic, or turnips. If the family had prepared a thick vegetable pottage, a hearty stew made with cabbage, peas, beans, onions, herbs, and whatever vegetables were available, it could be carried in a clay pot and shared among several workers. Meat was uncommon. A small piece of smoked bacon or salted pork might occasionally be added for flavor, but vegetables and grains remained the foundation of most meals. Fresh fruit, when available, came from nearby orchards or wild berry bushes rather than markets. To drink, peasants often chose weak ale, which contained very little alcohol and was considered safer than untreated water in many places. Clean springs and wells certainly existed, but water quality varied depending on location. Lunch wasn't a time for long conversations or relaxation. After eating, workers usually rested only briefly before returning to the fields. Harvest season could determine whether a family would have enough food to survive the winter, so wasting daylight wasn't an option. One surprising fact is that medieval peasants ate a more seasonal diet than most people today. Their meals changed dramatically throughout the year, depending on what was growing, what had been preserved, and what remained in storage from previous harvests.
How church bells controlled daily life to see what time it is. Medieval peasants had no watches, no clocks, and certainly no smartphones. Instead, the sound of church bells organized nearly every part of daily life. The bells announced morning prayers, Sunday services, weddings, funerals, and important religious festivals. They also served as an emergency warning system. A different pattern of ringing could alert the entire village to a fire, an approaching enemy, or another urgent danger. For most people, church bells were the closest thing they had to a public announcement system. Religion itself shaped the entire calendar. The church determined when people fasted, when they celebrated major holidays, when marriages could take place, and when certain kinds of work were discouraged or forbidden. This also challenges another common myth. Medieval peasants did not work every single day of the year. Depending on the region, there could be dozens of religious feast days when heavy labor was reduced or suspended altogether. These celebrations offered rare opportunities to gather with neighbors, attend church services, enjoy music, dance, markets, and community meals. The local church wasn't simply a place of worship, it was the center of village life. Important news was announced there, disputes were settled nearby, festivals began there, and the community gathered during both joyful and tragic moments. Even people who couldn't read knew the rhythm of the church's calendar by heart. The passing of time wasn't measured in hours and minutes, but in saints' days, harvest festivals, Lent, Easter, and Christmas. What happened after the workday ended? After spending hours working in the fields, you might imagine that medieval peasants simply went home and collapsed into bed. In reality, the work was far from over. Returning from the fields meant beginning an entirely different set of responsibilities. Livestock had to be fed again. Water needed to be carried from the well. Firewood had to be chopped. The cooking fire needed attention, and the evening meal had to be prepared. If an animal was sick or had wandered away, finding it became an urgent priority. Losing livestock could threaten a family's survival. After dinner, many households continued working by firelight. Men repaired plows, sharpened sickles, fixed fences, mended carts, or made wooden tools. Women spun wool into thread, wove cloth, sewed clothing, repaired old garments, prepared food for the next day, or preserved supplies for the coming winter. Nearly everything a family needed had to be made or repaired by hand. Buying replacements simply wasn't an option for most people. Yet evenings weren't entirely consumed by work. Once the essential tasks were finished, families gathered around the hearth. They talked, shared stories, sang songs, and entertained children with folk tales about saints, heroes, ghosts, dragons, and mysterious creatures. Since very few villagers could read, storytelling became one of the main ways knowledge and traditions were passed from one generation to the next. Long winter evenings were especially important. Without modern entertainment, conversation itself became the center of family life. Although medieval peasants worked incredibly hard, their homes weren't silent places of endless labor. They were filled with stories, laughter, music, and traditions that helped communities remain connected through generations. What time did medieval peasants go to bed? Without electricity, television, or artificial lighting, medieval people's daily routines were closely tied to the sun. Most peasants went to bed not because they were tired of working, but because there was little reason to stay awake after darkness fell. Wax candles were expensive and were mainly used in churches, monasteries, or wealthy households. Ordinary families relied on rushlights or tallow candles made from animal fat. These gave off a weak, smoky light, smelled unpleasant, and burned quickly. Every minute a candle remained lit meant using up a valuable resource. As a result, after finishing the evening meal, feeding the animals one last time, and completing any essential household chores, most families prepared for bed. During the summer, they stayed awake a little longer because daylight lasted well into the evening. In winter, however, many people were asleep by 7 or 8 o'clock. Surprisingly, historians believe that many medieval Europeans practiced what is known as segmented sleep. Instead of sleeping for 8 uninterrupted hours, they often slept for several hours, woke naturally around midnight for an hour or two, and then returned to bed until dawn. During this quiet period, people might pray, talk with family members, tend the fire, nurse a baby, or even complete small household tasks. This pattern seems unusual today, but before artificial lighting became common, it was completely normal. Most peasant homes had only one main room, so entire families often slept together. Parents, children, and sometimes even elderly relatives shared the same sleeping space. Beds were simple wooden frames filled with straw mattresses, while poorer families sometimes slept directly on straw spread across the floor. For medieval peasants, sleep wasn't a luxury. It was preparation for another demanding day of physical labor. One of the biggest myths about the Middle Ages is that peasants worked every single day of their lives without rest. While their lives were certainly difficult, reality was much more complicated. Agricultural work was highly seasonal. During planting and harvest, people worked incredibly hard because the success of the harvest determined whether their families would survive the coming winter. But outside these busy seasons, the pace of life slowed considerably. Religion also played a major role in creating breaks from work. Throughout the year, the Christian calendar included numerous feast days honoring important religious events and saints. On many of these occasions, heavy agricultural labor was discouraged or stopped altogether. Depending on the region and historical period, peasants might observe dozens of religious holidays each year. These weren't vacations in the modern sense, but they did provide valuable opportunities to rest from fieldwork. Feast days were often filled with church services, village markets, music, dancing, games, communal meals, and celebrations. For many people, they were the highlights of the year and an important chance to strengthen relationships within the community.
Winter also brought a different rhythm of life. Although there was still plenty of work to do, repairing tools, caring for animals, spinning wool, weaving cloth, and preparing equipment for spring, the exhausting pace of summer farming disappeared. In other words, medieval peasants didn't live in a constant state of endless labor. Instead, their lives followed the natural cycle of the seasons, alternating between periods of intense work and periods of relative calm.
How much did a medieval peasant walk every day? Modern fitness experts often encourage us to walk 10,000 steps a day. For medieval peasants, walking wasn't exercise, it was simply life. Everyday tasks required constant movement. They walked to the fields before sunrise and back home after sunset. They carried water from wells or streams, gathered firewood from nearby forests, took grain to the village mill, led animals to pasture, visited local markets, and attended church services on foot. Depending on the season and the type of work they were doing, a peasant could easily walk 10 to 20 kilometers, 6 to 12 miles, in a single day, sometimes even more. Unlike modern walking paths, medieval roads were often muddy, uneven, rocky, or completely unpaved. During rainy seasons, they became difficult to cross, while in winter, snow and ice created additional challenges. Footwear offered little comfort. Wealthier people wore sturdy leather shoes, but poorer peasants often owned only one pair, which had to last for years. Damaged shoes were repeatedly repaired rather than replaced, and walking barefoot during warm weather wasn't uncommon for the poorest members of society. Women covered impressive distances as well. They carried water, gathered herbs, worked in gardens, tended livestock, visited neighbors, and traveled to church or local markets. Children also spent much of their day walking, while helping with household chores or watching over sheep, goats, or geese. Perhaps the most remarkable difference from modern life is that medieval people never considered this physical activity to be exercise. They weren't trying to stay fit or burn calories. Every step they took had a purpose. Walking wasn't a hobby, it was essential for survival. For the average medieval peasant, movement wasn't something you scheduled into your day, it was the day itself. After spending a day in the life of a medieval peasant, one thing becomes clear. The Middle Ages were far more complex than the stereotypes we've inherited from movies and popular culture. Life certainly wasn't easy. Every day revolved around hard physical labor, unpredictable weather, and the constant challenge of producing enough food to survive another winter. There were no modern conveniences, no electricity, no supermarkets, and no safety net if the harvest failed. At the same time, medieval life wasn't the endless nightmare it's often portrayed to be. People celebrated holidays, shared meals with their families, laughed together, told stories around the fire, raised children, and built close-knit communities. They adapted to the world they knew, creating traditions and routines that had been passed down for generations. Perhaps the biggest lesson is that history is rarely as simple as we imagine. the reality is almost always more nuanced and far more interesting than the myths. If you enjoyed this journey into everyday life during the Middle Ages, there are many more fascinating stories waiting to be explored. From medieval medicine and castles to Viking life, ancient civilizations, forgotten traditions, and historical mysteries, there is still so much to discover. If you'd like to see more carefully researched history videos like this one, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps support the creation of more in-depth, high-quality content and allows me to keep bringing history to life in new and engaging ways. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.